Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rahul Verma and I work here at the Center for Policy Research. And this is the sixth conversation in our series on how India votes. And hopefully in the run-up to 2024 elections, we'll be able to touch very diverse themes and try to understand how Indians participate and engage in electoral arena. Today, we have three distinguished speakers and panelists, and all three of them have been writing on Indian elections and have been, have contributed a lot to our understanding of how Indians engage in electoral arena. Let me introduce you to them. First, we have Supriya Sharma. Supriya is an executive editor of Scroll.in. And something about Supriya and why I'm interested in her work, and I didn't know her before 2014, but I followed her dispatches very religiously during the 2014 election when she traveled from Guwahati to Delhi on a train, it was for more than a month. And I think every second or third day, there was a dispatch to, on the Scroll website. And since then, I've been regularly following her work, not just on elections, but on other things as well. So welcome, Supriya. Thank you for agreeing to join us. Sajjan Kumar. Sajjan has perhaps in one decade traveled more states and covered more elections than any of us. So Sajjan has written on elections, but he has also written on other things. Most recently, his co-authored book with Professor Sudha Pai on Maya Modi Azad actually brings forth the new churning in Dalit politics, especially in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Previously, he has written another book with Professor Pai, which is titled as Everyday Communalism, and how new varieties of communalism is taking shape on the ground. Thank you, Sajjan, for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you.
My third guest is Saundarya Chithambaram. Saundarya teaches at Bucknell University, and she has been writing on the issues of patronage, welfare, and what kind of welfare politics matter for citizens both in rural and urban India. Thank you, Saundarya, for joining us today.
Thank you, Rahul.
So let me sort of start the conversation by framing some of the issues, and hopefully I'll start with Saundarya first, and then to Sajjan and Supriya with brief opening remarks, and we'll come back to each one of them with some questions emerging from their opening remarks. And I'll request everyone who has joined us today to keep putting your comments or questions on Q&A box, and I'll try to weave some of them during the conversations, but my guests can also answer them online if they wish to, but we'll take those questions towards the end of the session. And so the reason why I wanted to have a conversation on narratives, what issues are important for voters and how that process takes shape, is because we also have lots of mythical ideas about how voters engage in the electoral arena. Some data which basically suggests there are 1/3 of voters who actually make up their mind much before even the elections get announced. So these are basically partisan voters. They are loyalists or believers, and they are pretty much sure which party they are voting for. And anyone who has traveled during elections would know that these are the loudest voices. Like even before you ask them what's happening in the election, they would tell you which party they like and why everyone should vote for that party and why this party is winning. There's roughly 1/3 of the voters who actually decide where to lean during the campaign. They are basically looking at the candidate, how alliances have taken shape. They're typically not the believers, but they're still tilting towards one party. They just need some more information to make up their mind. And then there is 1/3 of the voters who actually decide perhaps during the last week of election. And then there are within that 1/3, the last 1/3, I think there are two kinds of voters. One who are very sophisticated and they just want to understand who is basically, the Hindi parlance is hawa kis taraf beh rahi hai. And they just want to understand hawa kis taraf beh rahi hai, and they will tilt towards that party. And then the other group is actually trying to figure out, they might get influenced by their local community leaders, they might get influenced by family and friends. And so the first question really for my panelists is to understand how this sort of process takes shape, and who are the actors who influence these last 1/3 or 1/2 of voters in Indian politics. And so let me start with Saundarya and then to Sajjan and Supriya. And please feel free to bring in other elements that you deem relevant to this conversation on how narratives take shape and what factors are important in shaping those narratives and what actually is narrative, right? Like when we keep using the word narrative, but what do we mean by narrative, and what issues are part of narrative and what issues get kicked out of that narrative.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, first of all, for this opportunity to be part of this great series of conversations. And thank you to Center for Policy Research for being an incredible place that has nurtured a lot of young scholars and done very engaging research. So coming to the question that you're asking, I think, when do people make up their mind? Is it close to the election, and what's going on in the voters' minds? This is, as you delve into this is one of the hardest questions to actually answer when it comes to Indian politics in many ways. So I think Irfan was on a few weeks ago and said precisely this, that, we have a lot of incredible data that sort of gives us a sense of what general aggregate trends are with respect to voting behavior, but we just don't have a very good model for predicting what is going on in the voter's mind, particularly the 1/3 that you're talking about that are deciding on the day of election. Are they sophisticated? Are they sort of making strategic calculations and things like that? So to put this in comparative perspective, I was thinking about sort of what models and theories of voting behavior exist out there. So one is, of course, the rational voter model, which is very sort of well known, that, people will vote for the political party or the candidate that's closest to them in terms of preferences. And this could be sort of prospective voting, which is, mehengai bahut badh gayi hai. So, I care about that. So I'm going to vote for a party that is addressing that, versus mehengai bahut badh gayi thi, retrospective voting, that I'm going to punish the party that, did not do well on, policies that mattered to me. And India's record on rational voter model is sort of weird, right? Because India doesn't really fit the narrative. Although there are sort of recent studies, like Milan Vaishnav has a study that sort of indicates this, that particularly since 2009, people are becoming more sophisticated and engaging in sort of this kind of retrospective economic voting. The second is sort of partisanship, right? Exactly what Rahul was talking about with the sort of first 1/3 of voters, right? That they have stable partisan preferences, and that's what, sort of predicts election outcomes. Except, there's a lot of volatility in Indian elections. So, preferences are not stable. Partisanship is not stable. So then how do we sort of decide this? The third is emotional. What is the emotive appeal of candidates and sort of political parties? And then finally, the trope that we are all sort of very familiar with, which is, almost the fallback kind of version, which is, people vote their caste, right? This is all about patronage politics, clientelistic politics. How people make up their mind is really about sort of their social group, their identity, right? And a lot of this is about vote buying. So this is, I think, where a lot of ethnography work, such as what Supriya has done, which is incredible, and Sajjan has done on the ground. Keeping your ear to the ground, I think, is very important to bring nuance to these conversations, right? So are voters swayed by these goodies at the last minute, right? Or are they sort of, thinking more strategically about issues? So I can give you two vignettes very briefly from my own fieldwork, which is, I was in Delhi researching in urban slums, 2015, late January, early February, state elections, campaigning is going on. Aam Aadmi Party is campaigning. All the other parties are trying their best. Anyone who had their ear to the ground would have known that, this was going to be resoundingly a victory for the Aam Aadmi Party. And not because of inducements, not because of goodies, but precisely because they didn't offer anything of that sort, right? So I was doing research in one of the slums in Southwest Delhi, where there were people from all sorts of parties and political alignments. I don't want to name anyone because all parties do this, right? So there was this nudge, nudge, wink, wink, aaj meeting mein aa jana shaam ko, because there is going to be sort of liquor and, cash that is going to go around and get distributed and all of that. And so this person from the political party started talking about how हमारे विधायक ने इस बस्ती के लिए बहुत कुछ किया है, आग लग गई थी तो पैसे दिए, कंबल दिए. And so I'm talking to this woman in the slum who's been sort of hearing all of this. And then she comes in and sort of gets really angry and says, क्या हमारा वोट इतना सस्ता है कि एक कंबल के लिए बिक जाएंगे हम? Right? So this is kind of what comes out in a lot of conversations that people have on the ground, right? And this is sort of corroborated by a lot of ethnographic work. Lisa Bjorkman, who talks about voters in Bombay, Mary Breeding, who's done this in the context of Karnataka. And this is not to say that vote buying doesn't exist, or not vote buying, that goodies don't exist, that inducements don't exist. So 2009, I'm doing dissertation research in Chennai, right? An incredible place to study patronage and clientelism and all of that. And so I'm talking to this woman who is my confidant and who tells me that, you know, there were 1,000 rupees notes attached to the morning newspaper delivery. And I was like, okay, so, you know, did that influence who you vote for? And she was like, of course not. Like, you know, what matters to me are other things. So when you ask people in slums what matters to them, for instance, in the Delhi slum, it was bijli, sadak, pani, shauchalay. Right? So people do have an expectation about generalized public service provision, no matter which socioeconomic category they're from. So this whole sort of notion about the poor, you know, votes are, you know, poor voters think a certain way or behave a certain way. It gets negated very quickly when you get into this ethnographic work, right? And then Rahul, you've done this, Rahul and Pradeep Chibber's brilliant book, Ideology and Identity, sort of does this in very painstaking sort of data heavy way and shows us that vote buying is completely a myth, right? And this is not to say that, you know, there is another paper by Heath and Tillin in SCID from 2018 that that says that, look, you know, there is some amount of sway that inducements have, and that really depends on institutional capacity, right? So there is some correlation, but, you know, we can't sort of really bank on that. And this is not something that influences a lot of people. Which then brings us to sort of the question of issues. This was one of the prompts that Rahul had given me. What are the issues that, you know, help, that motivate people? And we hear survey after survey, 2014, 2019, we hear about development, we hear about corruption, right? But the question is, again, without ethnography and without sort of, you know, this nuanced perspective, we don't know what that means in local contexts, right? So what is corruption? If you ask, you know, people in GK2 or Sujan Singh Park, you know, they're going to have middle-class urban voters have a completely different sort of sense of what development means, what corruption means. Versus if you go to this Basti, Jugi Jopri, somewhere where, you know, they will have a very different view of what corruption is. So, you know, getting those nuances are very important in terms of how sort of issues motivate people. And again, there's a lot of variation there that we simply don't have a lot of data on, I think. And then finally, coming to the role of media, I think this was another question. And Supriya, obviously,
so can we come on the media thing later?
Okay.
Okay. Just so that
I'll stop there and let these be conversation starters that, you know.
No, thank you so much, Soundarya, especially putting, you know, first the theoretical lens, how to understand voting behavior and where does India fit into some of those frameworks. Now, let me take your last point, and Sajjan can add many things because he's traveled far and wide. But something that you mentioned at the last, which is, you know, these issues of development, vikas and corruption, like same thing gets talked everywhere. But they might mean very different things for very different communities. And so, Sajjan, in your experience over last 1 decade, first, has there been any change in what issues people are picking up? And second, you know, across different states, how do these narratives take shape? Is there any difference? Like, is Southern India very different from North? Is East very different from West? And what do vikas and you know, bhrashtachar, and because same issues, like if you do a survey, there are 3 or 4 or 5 things that will always top the chart, right? And so you have spoken to people on the ground and you get a chance to actually explore the meaning of those words. So please, Sajjan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. This question about how to what extent should you take people's response at their face value is one of the challenges that we are witnessing in the last, say, 6-7 years. Because, say, when as a students of when just student started in around 2010, Nitish Kumar's second stint, the election in Bihar. Up to that point, one of the things as a field investigator that we used to keep in mind was not to ask leading question. That was, a rule of the thumb, that never ask a leading question, never try to even educate or try to correct the respondent, because as a researcher, your job is to map out the state of voting behavior or people's behavior on the ground. But in the last, I'll say around 2017 onward, and as a researcher, I consciously started feeling that another challenge has emerged, and that is about how to tackle the leading responses, And leading responses are not coming just from the people who are very articulate. Leading responses are also coming from the people who may be at the bottom of pyramid in every sense on all indicators. Because I think people on the ground, they are so much studied, and they know when you arrive, when you step out, and when you are proceeding towards them, there is a sense of mapping out of the researcher, be a journalist, be an investigator, that, okay, you are coming to get something from them, and whatever they say is going to have some resonance, So this sense of connectivity is something wherein this is a methodological crisis wherein we don't know that sometimes you have to be combative, to the respondent, so that you read between the lines and you get into the nuances. Now, coming to how do we see today election narrative? What is the mechanism? How does it build? It's a complex process, and in various states, it do differ. But let's see. One of the commonality is that every respondent responds at two levels. One is what we call as the perception, war of perception, that every parties or institutions, war rooms, political leaders, sometimes the dominant caste communities, the ones who have power of articulation, social space, etc. So they build it. So when you go and talk to a respondent, and something that you call which way the wind is blowing, the first response you'll find, and that is shared, irrespective of your subjective behavior, would be confirming what do people in general think is going to happen. And that is shaped by the narrative that is a top-down process. This may be a conscious effort by political parties, leaders, war room strategists, or this may also from the societal and may be constituted by the people who dominate the public sphere, the conversation hijackers. Everywhere you do, they hijack the conversation. So this is one. And therefore, once we go to the field, we are always careful to map that what is the perception that we are finding from across the spectrum as a dominant perception. Then the second question immediately we ask that, what do you think? What is your subjective? You may think that BJP is going to win, or BJP is going to lose, or whatever the party. But when you contrast that, are you also going to go along the perception that you are sharing? And then we find the resonance and dissonance between the two. Many a times we do find that even people whose subjective political behavior may be other way around would also be sharing the perception that is the dominant perception. So therefore, the role of the actors in constituting the war of perception is central in today's arena, wherein the language and the categories that we employ to study them, that gets internalized by the people on the ground. So we may talk into an academic language about the categories that caste or parties or a dominant section or dominant issues like mahangai, corruption, misgovernance, lack of accessibility, arrogance, or some policy decision or anchor of the leadership, all these sort of things, they are there. And that is something that you find common across the spectrum. But there is always a subtext. An electoral narrative, as you start moving closer to the polling day, you find that electoral narratives start getting from simple to more complex, because those subtext or the silent voices, they also start, dropping hints Now the dropping hints, maybe if you're talking on a tea stall or in a localities wherein you have mixed social communities, you always find people who are silent, who are not, nodding enthusiastically to something articulated by the conversation hijacker. But as the election comes closer, you find that people do drop the hint. Let me give you one of the example. In 2022 UP election, first thing we decided to go to Safai, Akhilesh Yadav's village, to map out, and then we decided to talk to the non-Yadavs, because almost by the past experience we knew that better to utilize your time. And there was a small and better go with the people who we know they are not committed that way. There was a small stall of the ones who were serving some snacks, pakoras, etc. Very small, very poor. And we asked, what is going to happen? And because of the power equation, he said that I don't have to talk. We don't want to talk. And after much persuasion, saying that we are from the outside, nothing local stake is there, he said, it's all about the Akhilesh Bhaiya, because the village is there. And then tactically we asked that, which means that Yogi ji to gaya. That means. Then he said, no, Yogi ji is also there. So suddenly you find, because we have to navigate the power. So I said, it would be a futile thing to ask which party the person is going to vote because of the local power configuration. We asked that, give me one difference in the last 5 years, 12 to 70 of Akhilesh and 70 to 22 of Yogi. And the difference was, he said that, look, now it's inflation. And that is causing a lot of hardships. But there is some state support in terms of welfare scheme, etc. And then we are two brothers, we alternate in coming here. Whatever we sell, and by the way, somehow Gujara ho jara, we are surviving. Not good, but in 2012 to 17, one of the things that he highlighted was that the moment we open, some of the dominant people will come and sit and they will start drinking, and that will scare away the other customers. And by chance, sometimes I'll ask for the money, there would be some abusive and other remarks. So you get the hint. So they are always there. So, but when you move there, it is always the institutional dominance, the party, which has more war room and leadership advantage, and the dominant social communities, they together constitute what we call which way the wind is blowing, and that you get, say, 6 to 8 months before the election. As the election comes, we start finding the subtext or the voices that are more subservient, and they start coming. Now, different states, and that we can talk later, from northeast to Hindi heartland to the central to west to south. Now, in different states, there are different anchors. And let me drop a hint. If you go to the Himachal, always see what the government employees are going to do, because that's the biggest block. If you go to Punjab and Haryana, it's the organized farmers. If you go to UP and Bihar, be careful about the silent majority who always want to vote to a party or to a leader who they think is going to save them or protect them from the intermediary dominant caste or the upper caste dominant caste. That way it varies, and that aspect we can touch. But I think it starts with the war of perception, which is shared by all. And closer to the election, we find a very competing narrative between the dominant perception, the analytical category that we employ, and seems to be the case, and the subtext that start emerging and acquiring centrality closer to the election. So it's an interplay between the two.
Okay. Thank you, Sajjan. Supriya, again, like the broad two questions that I asked Saundarya and Sajjan, your own experience of covering elections over more than a decade, and what do you think basically shapes narrative, and what are the important factors? And sometimes we also get young PhD students and young journalists. And so what would be your way of telling them how they should be going on the field and, reporting in 2024 elections?
Thanks so much, Rahul. Thanks for inviting me to this discussion. It's always a pleasure to be at CPR, virtually as it may be, to be in the company of serious scholars and researchers like Saundarya and Sajjan, who've had such deep insights to offer. As a journalist, I'm an amateur by comparison, and I must warn you that essentially my observations are going to be, largely anecdotal, based on my experiences as a reporter and also as an editor, who works with reporters, many of whom are political junkies, as you know, also fine ones at that. I just like to start by saying that I'm glad that we're talking about the ground, because far too often political discourse in India is top down. I, for one, have sort of always believed that the best way to understand Indian politics is to cover elections on the ground by actually going out and talking to voters. And there are a bunch of reasons I feel so. One, particularly us as, you know, our community, the journalistic community, we spend far too much time talking to political actors in the national capital or in state capitals, wherever we live and work. And while talking to politicians is good, they are, well, arguably, you know, the best informed on the subject because they have actual skin in the game. They come with their own biases and blinkers, and there's a real danger of getting bogged down by that. Two, you know, until recently, I would argue most Indians actually lived in some sort of a semi-media dark zone where, you know, even if they had access to media, they weren't consuming a lot of it. They were picking cues from conversations in their actual physical environment, in their communities, in their neighborhoods. And so if you wanted to know where the political wind is blowing, you know, there was no better place to go to, cliche as it may sound, than the chai ki dukan or the charaha or, you know, even the village hand pump where you'll be able to talk to women. Now, is that sort of changing because of the greater penetration of media and social media? Should we be paying more attention now to what's happening on Facebook or on WhatsApp or YouTube? That's something we could come back to later. But there's a third factor that I also felt, you know, kind of made it important to go to the ground. Unlike other countries where there's sort of a lot of political data thrown up by surveys, like, you know, there's sort of regular polling of voters to see how attitudes are shifting. For the longest time, we didn't have that. Other than the Lok Niti surveys, we really didn't have much data to go by. And so there was no option other than sort of putting in the hard slog and going out and talking to people. So I'm glad that even Saundarya sort of mounted this defense of ethnography, and, you know, as journalists, we rarely use that term, although we do quite a lot of it. I also strongly feel that, you know, it is important to actually have an ear to the ground. Now, I want to also say that there are valid concerns with this sort of an approach, because you can at best speak to a small set of voters. Often, as Sajjan pointed out, the ones who will sort of speak up the most are the partisans, the most vocal of the partisans, to an extent that they even drown out other voices. And there are, of course, significant barriers still, you know, social barriers like caste, religion, gender. For instance, even as a woman reporter, I know it's like doubly hard to actually seek out the views of women voters. So even if you're trying your best, you're only going to be able to pick up fragments from the ground. Now, if the aim is to build a definitive account of the elections, or to be even more ambitious and try and predict its outcome, then you're likely to fall short. But if you go with more modest aims, if you see groundwork during elections as sort of an opportunity to understand what's changing in society, you know, the political churn, then I think this approach has a lot to offer. For instance, you can gauge the extent of political polarization when you go to a geographical region and talk to people from very similar economic backgrounds, and then find that they have polar opposite views on even economic matters like inflation. For instance, you're talking to farmers. Let's be more specific. You're talking to tobacco farmers in Gujarat, as one of my colleagues, Arunabh Saikia, did in the last Gujarat elections. And one set of farmers sort of are complaining about rising input cost, falling farm prices, while another set is actually completely justifying what's happening. They're not denying it, but they are sort of justifying it. And the reason simply has to do with that, you know, one set is kind of sees itself as aligned with the ruling party and the other doesn't. Now, of course, this bit of information is significant if you're trying to understand what's happening in that particular election, because it tells you something about voter preferences. But I'd argue that it's actually, you know, it has a larger significance because it also tells you something about, you know, something deeper that's happening in Indian politics, which is, like, I think, you know, I've been kind of reporting now for nearly 2 decades. I feel like it's become more frequent to see this kind of complete split in voter perception, which to me seems to suggest that we are in an era of hyper partisanship. But just when you start thinking along these lines, there's a googly, and you find that the same set of voters who you thought were partisans, because in the Lok Sabha election, when you met them, they were kind of sort of staunchly, sort of defending the BJP or declaring their support for the BJP. And then comes assembly election and they're flipped and they're voting for another party. And that sort of indicates that voters are differentiating between national elections and state elections. So how does this tie up with, our sense that there's more partisanship? Now, thankfully, as a journalist, like, we don't have to synthesize these very disparate trends into theory. We can just get away by telling interesting stories and hoping that they're bringing some insight. The challenge is, of course, greater for political scientists. But, just to say that no matter where you're coming from, going to the ground keeps you nimble, makes you think harder. It can also be frightening, actually, because sometimes when I've been out reporting during elections, I feel like I'm getting lost in the minutiae, because there's just so much happening. There's so many local factors, candidate, this, that you kind of really sometimes worry that you're missing the wood for the trees. But the ground also throws up several clarifying moments, and I just wanted to share one. This is from the 2019 Lok Sabha election. Sensing that BJP was clear for a front runner, I decided to focus my reporting on understanding why people were voting for the BJP, those who were. And one of the places I traveled to was Eastern Maharashtra, Bhandara, where the paddy sowing season was on, and women were sort of spending the entire day in the fields transplanting and sowing paddy. And so, if I did do the usual of talking to the others, but I also was trying to seek out the views of women. So I went over to the fields, and I remember standing on the edge of a field, shouting out to the women who were working there, saying, I'm a reporter and I want to know, which party are you voting for? And I mean, they were really doing hard labor, and most of them couldn't be, the least bothered to talk to this random person who's shown up. But one of them did look up, and she just said one thing. She said, which party does Modi belong to? And I felt like that said it all, more than any kind of exposition could. That one response from that woman voter gave us a sense of just how presidential the 2019 election was.
Oh, thank you so much.
Lots of other things will come back to that, but I'll stop here for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Supriya. I completely share your worldview, though I also get excited on the exit poll night. But I share your worldview that elections are actually a window to understand how society is changing. And as social scientists and as journalists, I think that should be our primary focus. Predicting part is just like a side game, like we all play for 24 hours and then it's done. But I also hope, like, that since you have covered these elections now for over 10 years, one day you'll get time and you'll sit and, weave a story which will be greater than all the stories you have written so far. So thank you, Supriya. Now let me come back to first Sajjan and then Saundarya and then Supriya again. But Sajjan, I want to understand two things. I think while you were closing your opening remarks, you made a very interesting point that when you travel from, like when you go to different states, like you go to Himachal, you want to look at what government employees are talking. In Punjab, it's about organized farmers. And in UP and Bihar, it's about the silent majority. So my first question is how, like, these two things hang together, which is like in one place you are looking at the dominant communities in terms of like power dynamics, and in the other case you're basically looking at the sort of like non-dominant, both in terms of like like resources. And second question is something related to, you basically said that the elections narrative from like 6 months to closer to the election, it basically moves from simple to complex. And And I think what might be happening, that the war of perception and the subjective responses might be basically getting close. And you keep mentioning something like war rooms might also be shaping. So now, like, have these war rooms now we have, like, are they in Delhi, Lucknow, and Chennai, or now we have district level war rooms everywhere?
Yeah, let me respond to the first question. I mean, why did I choose some states wherein the dominant anchors maybe the anchors may belong to the dominant sections of the society, while, as I mentioned, in Hindi heartland states and also in other states, I'm more conscious of how because that's because of the numerical strength. Because if you want to read an election, it's not about simplifying the election. It's about that gives you, because in Himachal, it's a state wherein government employee constitute, they are the prime, not only influencer in terms of weaving the narrative, but they are also the ones who shape in a way, the direction. And that is why you find that every 5 election, the government employees are always the unhappy employees. That happen. And even without Veerbhadra Singh, one of the very charismatic leader of Himachal Pradesh across party line, Congress was able to make a comeback, because government employees issues of old pension scheme, it was the most resonant there. And BJP's incumbent Chief Minister Jairam Thakur mocked them by saying, if you want to have pensions, contest elections, be an MLA or a minister, you will have pensions, that mockery. Anyway, this is about the numerical strength, they have the influence. But let me tell you why it's important to know the psychology of different states. And this is not about a reductionist, approach that we are losing out on. This is because it gives you a starting point, and contrasted to that, you can now try to get other voices. Because when we, in political science and in elections, one of the things that specific to India is that here, in majority of the state, we have 2 competing models of anti-incumbency, Barring few exceptions, when you go there, there is always anti-incumbency, which is against sentiment against or dissatisfaction against the incumbent party, right? So that is political incumbency, anti-incumbency, that is there. So whether a person may be voting to Gehlot in Rajasthan, but in no majority of them will complain. A person may end up voting for, say, for example, BJP in UP, but if you talk to, they will complain around the issues that we talk about: inflation, unemployment, corruption, lack of accessibility of the representative, etc., etc. But what is more important, that along with that, there is always a more intense anti-incumbent, that is a social anti-incumbent. And every state, there is a fault line which determines that there is always a competition between the political anti-incumbency and the social anti-incumbency. What is the social anti-incumbency? Let me give some very simple examples. So in UP and Bihar, we know, barring for Western UP and that Meerut Muzaffarnagar part, it is anti-Yadav, that is always there. And that unites sections of the society who may not share the material interests, the upper caste, the weaker OBCs, majority of the Dalits, etc. Right? If you go to Haryana and Western UP, that is the sugarcane belt, then certainly anti-Jat sentiment is there. They may share, majority of the non-Jats also may share the social issues, economic issues, like agrarian thing, when the protest is going on the agrarian issues, farmers issues. You go on the ground and people will agree normatively, rationally, that yes, these are important issues. But then you ask them that, are you going also to create a political alliance? There would be a filter, there will be a writer. Why? Because people always have a very everyday wisdom. And what is everyday wisdom? That people's rationality on the ground is determined in the final analysis, the phrase that we use many a times when we write, that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues. These issues are important. These issues may be mundane. However, people on the ground do not make up their mind on the basis of singularity of the event or issues. They always have this complex kind of thing, wherein in the final analysis, what do they feel? Now, let me give you one example that will clarify. In Assam in 2021, when while I was doing the fieldwork, one of the issues that was most crucial was pro-NRC and anti-CAA sentiment, except for the Hindu Bengalis, that is the Barak Valley. Assam has Brahmaputra Valley and Barak Valley. So ideally, BJP should have been a bind because pro-NRC and anti-CAA section or sentiment constituted the electoral majority. And here is a party which, because of the parallel election in Bengal, because their pro-CAA sentiment is crucial, BJP decided to come on board openly in a bold way about that they are going to implement CAA. That should have created a setback in Assam, even among the newly constituted social base of the BJP. But it didn't happen. Now, because we as an investigator were also trying to understand this paradox, that rationally, when we are talking about NRC, that I'm talking about issues versus elections. So majority of the, say, for example, in upper Brahmaputra Valley from Lakhimpur, Dhemaji, Tejpur, and southern side, you have Shivsagar, Jorhat, Dibrugarh, Tinsukia, etc. When we're talking to the people about the issues, there was a unanimity that CAA should not be implemented, and that is wrong. But the moment we wanted to know, will it affect or translate seamlessly into their voting behavior, the question was no. But you know what? One of the tribal responded, tribal boy who was around 2022 or something, he said that, look, we do understand that CAA is bad and we oppose it. But if we go by the issue, we know that Congress is championing anti-CAA sentiment. But who are the people? Who are the leader? Who are the anchor? What is their caste? What is their community? They said it is Gaurav Gogoi and Ahom. They have been ruling Assam for decades. It is Debrat Sekia, LOP, and Ahom. It is Akhil Gogoi, the activist who was literally creating a civil society sentiment against CAA and Ahom. So then he said that I also say that when I go by the issue, it is going to cater to the core interest of a community which has denied representation to us. And these people cannot tolerate, these people means the pro-CAA, that is Congress, that one of the tribal, that time Sonowal was the incumbent chief minister, one of our brethren, he was not a Sonowal tribe, he was a different tribe. One of the our tribal brother is the CAA. So that is why we are also careful about representation. What I am trying to say, that people's rationality, and that is why I would like to complicate, the binary of a rational and emotional voter. Because I think people's sense of rationality is more complicated, wherein along with the issue, they also want to see who is the anchor, who is the leader, who is the face. And this is something that gives you a clue how the things are going to operate. And that is why I said that there are many states wherein the dominant anchor happens to be numerical minority.
Okay.
They may be significant, but they do not constitute. But they are so dominant, Jats in Haryana and Western UP, Yadavs in UP and Bihar, Ahom in, say, for example, Assam, similarly Marathas in Maharashtra. Only state, I think, wherein the anchor also becomes, the dominant anchors becomes the normative reference is the Patidars. I never understood why Gujarat emerged as an exception, because I found anti-Maratha sentiment in Maharashtra. I mean, non-Marathas have some sense of coalescing. Then you find anti-Jat in Haryana, anti-Yadav in UP, Bihar, etc., anti-Ahom sentiment. And similarly, you found the same resonance, Lingayat, Voktilega sort of counter-consolidation in various pockets. That happens. But in Gujarat was the one sole exception wherein we found that while Patidars are absolute dominant communities, but we do not found that there may be antagonism, but there was no counter-consolidation. There were a couple of castes, but that was there. So that sort of question that why certain issues which are so rational, economically, they should, when we employ the rational choice theory, a rational voter should ideally vote along his or her economic and social interest. But something that happens is more, and that is why I think as a methodological input along with political economy approach, which is about a rational approach, we also have to employ the political psychology approach, that what sort of rationality people think on the ground, what is rational to them. And that is why the question of the anchor and representation is very important, because many a times people do complain about the issues, but they do not have enough confidence that voting for an alternative party, and that's the reality in many states, is going to ameliorate their situation. This is one. Now, therein the role of war rooms can be useful, but there is also limitation, because most of the war rooms also, or the strategists also, they also go by the kind of assumption with which we also start our investigation of the ground, because most of the time our starting assumption is based upon the past elections. It's based upon the kind of categories, languages, which we do employ. For example, the question of freebies that has emerged, that closer to the election 6 months or 3 months before, you find it has been a trend for the last 20 years that come election, and you'll find the incumbent government comes up with a lot of fascinating, not only promises, but they do implement that, and that is something but does that alter people's vote? The answer is very different, because we do know that despite all the things in 2018, the Rice Baba, the Chaur Baba, Raman Singh lost Chhattisgarh in 2018. Shivraj Singh, who is considered to be for pro-women and girl child mama, he lost election, even if votes were closed. So what I'm saying that war rooms also may not have the kind of impact that we think is going to, we assume that that today the voting choices are shaped, and we are living into the age wherein the people have, somehow lost the active agency, and they are more enamored by the kind of narrative that is imposed on them. What I'm saying that people on the ground are a bit careful. They may not talk about it. And war room may succeed when in the final analysis, their strategy resonates. And expecting that a couple of issues are going to change, how fascinating they may be, I think people on the ground may not be swayed by them unless and until in their final analysis, that is a overall analysis, the incumbent government antagonistically or in terms of the choice have crossed the threshold. So unless the threshold is also, criticism and appreciation should not be taken as a anti-vote or a pro-vote.
Thank you, Sajjan. Thank you so much. Let me now turn to Saundarya. So, Saundarya, first I want to, add or finish your thought on social media thing and how it might be changing narratives. But I also wanted to add 2 comments to that. Something which came out from Sajjan's intervention, he seems to be suggesting that, it's not 1 or 2 issues that completely changes election outcomes. People are basically looking at a bouquet of things and then making a final decision whether you are on this side or on that side, right? And so something that you mentioned in your first intervention about the retrospective and prospective voting. And in some ways, what I hear from Sajjan, that these 2 things are not different. In fact, like these 2 calculations, the retrospective and prospective is also taking place at the same time. So some comment on that. And the second one is like how social media is sort of like, is it changing the narrative or it just remains another actor, as Sajjan was also mentioning about war rooms, that they are there, but it's not that they significantly shift how people think.
Thanks, Rahul. First of all, thank you, Sajjan, for just a fascinating insight into sort of how India votes and how this kind of contextually varies, right? And I think Sajjan was absolutely right in terms of how a lot of literature sort of takes these rational voter models for granted. These are all sort of pertaining to Western democracies. And then we say, hey, economics should matter, and then start building hypotheses and theories around those. And absolutely, I think this is kind of what comes out from ethnographic studies that, ultimately, when people are talking about inflation or people are talking about sort of vikas, it really varies in terms of it could sort of have very strong social components of how people read this issue on the ground, right? That, Vikas is not sort of purely economic calculus, right? For a lot of voters, that it is about sort of social representation. It is about who they are, what is their sort of intersectional identity vis-a-vis these other people, and how do they experience economic development, I think. And that's kind of what comes through in a lot of ethnographic studies as well, and completely sort of point well taken. And I think the point of the emotive sort of aspect that Sajjan was talking about, and sort of combining that to what Supriya said earlier about, how this person said Modi, which party is Modi from, and sort of uniting that and segueing into the media stuff. But again, how people perceive. So this was 2014, right? When everybody is shocked that the UPA has rolled out this extensive program of welfare and rights-based legislations and Narega and all of that. And somehow it hasn't resonated with precisely the people who it was meant to serve, right? Or, they voted against them. So a lot of this is also, I think, media perception or emotive sort of appeals, right? What I'm trying to say is, so there's a lot of literature. I think Rahul and Pradeep do this in their book, where they talk about how even though welfare schemes are often centrally legislated, right? But how they are perceived really depends on which state you're in, right? And how the person on the ground is receiving those benefits. Are these benefits being siphoned away by, these dominant groups, this numerical majorities, like, the Jats or the Yadavs, and so, even though there is a Avas, Indira Avas Yojana or, whatever, are the benefits sort of trickling down? And that really depends on the state governments, right? Or how local sort of social, power dynamics and, social identity dynamics and all of that. So I think kind of factoring that into how we think about economics, how we think about sort of how people are swayed by economic issues is very important. And I think this is what I was trying to sort of, the point that I was trying to make in a very unsophisticated way in my EPW commentary after 2014, that, when you think about where there was anti-incumbency or where, there was, a pro-BJP wave, is it sort of about Modi, or is it about the perception of a lot of these Narega type schemes at the state government level that, did not match up to, what the central government was promising in a sense? But this is kind of where I think the media comes in. So I think it was, Deshpande et al. Recently, or after the 2019 elections, looked at the NES survey and sort of said that it seems that there has been a change in mindset and perception of people, that, there is more attribution of credit to the central government for welfare schemes, right? And that's kind of where I think the media really matters. And this is exactly what, Nilanjan Sarkar wrote about this with the politics of Vishwas, right? Where how does Modi sort of inspire this kind of loyalty? A lot of this is a function of media spending, right? The BJP outspends everybody in terms of, its domination of WhatsApp, of Facebook, of social media. And now, there are social influencers. It's not even WhatsApp and Facebook, it's TikTok now, right? So, who are the influencers, and are the BJP sort of able to mobilize those people who then reach out to these very local sort of micro communities, right? And how is that perception being built? So what sort of Sajjan is talking about might very well be influenced by or shaped by social media in the coming years. And that would be a very, very interesting trend to watch, I think.
No, thank you, Saundara. On that front, like in Madhya Pradesh, now Chief Minister and leader of opposition, they are meeting social media influencers and they are facilitating them. Everyone is basically trying to woo, I don't want to take names, but basically people with like 100,000 YouTube followers or millions of, Instagram followers. And they are in terms like going to be new campaigners for political party, whether they will join the party or they will, like, they'll be free for next election for that party and this election, that party will figure that out. But I think that's where things are heading. Supriya, before I bring you in, I just wanted to request audience, if you have questions, please do put it on Q&A box. After Supriya's comments, we'll take some of those questions. Supriya, I wanted to basically ask you 2-3 things, and they are short points. One, Sajjan said something in the beginning, which is about like you have to sometimes be combative with your respondents. And so during my PhD dissertation, I have done that, because especially when you are meeting politicians, you at some point you have to do that, because they will basically they will see you as a voter and they will basically give you like 30-minute speech. You are a young person and youth should play a big role in politics. And at some point you'll have to say, boss, I have these questions. If if you don't want to answer, then just get me tea and I'll go. The point which you make about Modi, as soon as the woman said Modi kis party se, and you knew about whether this election is president, did you contest or did you try to understand what is it about Modi? Or for that matter, if you go to even state elections, I think the elections are becoming leader-centric. Like in Delhi, it would be about Kejriwal. In Bihar, it would be about Nitish Kumar. In Bengal, it would be about Mamata Banerjee. So in all these states, you go to Andhra, it will be Jagan Reddy. Right? So is it so all leaders, what is basically driving, why is Indian politics becoming so leader-centric? Or was it always that it was just the phase of 90s when we didn't have these sort of charismatic personalities at the top? So that's first question, do you become combative? Do you sort of ask them, what is it about leaders that is making this happen? Second, and normatively, not normatively, we know that, you mentioned this, that it's better to go on the ground and try to hear what people are saying. And we know that the dominant groups, whether it's not just in terms of caste, occupation, but men talk very differently and women talk very differently. So even if I just focus on women, have you seen in different parts of the country, women speaking in different tones? Because what has happened in last 10 years, one, women turnout has gone up. Two, what we know that women have started voting more for BJP in comparison to past. In fact, in many states where BJP won post 2017, 2018, they're drawing more women voters. In UP, they had a higher share of women. In Assam. So in many places. So what is happening on the gender question and how they are part of this narrative shaping or receiving narratives? Supriya.
Thanks, Rahul. That's a whole bunch of questions. I just wanted to start by saying that, now as journalists, when we go out in the field to report, it's a far more complicated terrain for us, because people are always suspicious of who we are, far more than they were back in the day. That's also partly because I think more researchers are going out in the field. So political parties are doing much more research of their own. So the voter is always trying to figure out who you are and whether they really do want to engage with you in a way that, say, 15 years ago, it was much easier to go in and say, "Main patrakar hoon," or "Main pata karne aayi hu ki chunav mein kya ho raha hai." You can't just do that anymore. They really test you. And that's where, as Sajjan said, it's very interesting what he pointed out, that, our training is that we don't ask leading questions, but what happens when they're sort of leading responses? And this is a real challenge where you kind of almost feel that there's a script that's going around, where voter after voter is saying the same thing. So how do you push back? How do you get them to not say what is almost like a campaign line and sort of get more out of them? So there again, it really, it's almost now, it kind of takes a sort of, you have to pull many tricks out of the hat. You have to gauge the room and you have to see what's the best way to do it. Should you go combative? Should you try to disarm them? What card do you play? So I think conversations have become more challenging. It's kind of also, it's making us up our game in some ways. It's no longer, again, as was pointed out, you can't take the responses at face value. So you have to, you have to sort of work harder at trying to understand what is shaping voter behavior. As I said, partly because there's a script and partly because voters are now smarter. And that there's also this sort of very diverse landscape where they don't know where you're coming from. And in that sense, actually, again, the influencer thing that you mentioned is also complicating things because, clearly lines are blurring in a way that like when I go to a place and I say that I'm a journalist, I don't know what do people actually make of journalists anymore, because the fact that our top leaders now prefer giving interviews to like influencers and don't take questions from journalists. I understand their reasons to do that. They want softball questions. They don't want to actually have to respond to hard questions. But that just basically means now this is a highly complex field to go out in and report. What you asked about leaders. Now, that's kind of, it's sort of, I do think that Modi has had a huge impact across the board, where I see in all states now, you arrive and all you can see are big cutouts of the chief minister. And the personality cult is not new. We know that it was there, Jayalalitha, like lots of leaders, especially in the South, one kind of knew that there's this larger than life image of the leader. But I think it's now become ubiquitous. Like it's across every state, and the chief minister is not doing that. People are actually saying bechara. So, like I'm yet to go down to Rajasthan. There's an election looming, but the conversations that I've had with people there in the early years of the Gehlot government, the criticism was that he's doing a lot, but it's not visible. And so now in recent times, the conversation is that he's figured it out and he's more visible. He's making sure that he owns, his government scheme. So I think the fact that every morning I live in Delhi, I pick up the newspaper, the front page is always like a sort of a state government putting out an ad where the entire page is the chief minister, right? So we are now very much living through this sort of phase where, because of having a charismatic leader at the top, who's also very, very astutely used the media, sort of put his stamp on everything from vaccination certificates to, like everything. Every major scheme is Pradhan Mantri Yojana. So, there's this sort of personality cult that is paying off for the BJP at the national level, and every party is imbibing the message. Which is what we're seeing. And the fact that I'd argue that the other factor in this is a greater penetration of media. I think media is carrying these messages. Like one of the first elections I covered was the 2005 Bihar Assembly election, the one that brought Nitish Kumar to the leadership position in the state. And that, I remember I was a sort of young, wide-eyed reporter going out and sort of spending time and coming back to the office where there were seasoned journalists like my seniors. And I was sort of just like, kind of pour out everything that I had seen, heard. And I remember one conversation where one of my seniors just asked a very basic question. As I was describing what people said, she said, was this a village on the road or was this inside? So just the very fact that the location of the village was such a factor in how political messages travel, and that India has completely changed, where now even the remotest village you go, you find people are on smartphones. Like in the 2017 Uttar Pradesh Assembly election, I was staying in a village in Eastern UP, and in the morning, early morning, I ended up having a conversation with a farm worker who was just sort of right across there. And he asked me about like a sort of a news development, which I had no clue about. I'm a journalist, I'm supposed to know. So I was like, how do you know this has happened? Like something that happened in Lucknow. And he pulled out his phone and he showed me his news app. It's kind of really striking to see how much, like how big a factor media has become, media and social media. And it really makes you wonder whether this means that there is actually, it's a more competitive arena out there where there's greater diversity of information available on tap. And that does it mean that the voter is actually, you're going to have a phase where voters are actually, there's more atomized decision making as opposed to sort of community-based voting that we're sort of familiar with. But there obviously has to be a lot of careful study on this. But my hunch is that media is actually acting in tandem with traditional nodes as opposed to at cross purposes. Like I feel even the WhatsApp group, which we discuss endlessly because it's so important to shaping, our politics. I feel like that WhatsApp group means people are getting locked into the conversation that they would have in their gully mohallas, and that it's reinforcing as opposed to sort of complicating people's choices. But yeah, as a journalist, it's very, very fascinating to see like how much a big player the media is in the politics of our times.
Okay. No, thank you, Supriya. Anyone, if you have questions, please put it on Q&A box. There are two questions for Sajjan. Let me ask them to Sajjan first, and then I'll ask a few questions to Saundarya and Supriya if there are none. Sajjan, I think you said that you actually don't know the reason why there are no anti-Patidars sentiments in Gujarat, but if you want to add anything on that. Like, are there differences in voting patterns of Dalits in North and South India? That's the second question. And third is, why is still there anti-Yadav sentiment in Bihar, despite more Thakur MPs than Yadavs in Bihar?
Okay, about Gujarat, why I found when I said that Patidars who constitute around, I don't know, 15 to 20% is, if you talk to a Patidar, the dominant caste always inflate their number by certain percentage, but generally it's around 15%, 17%, something. I may be wrong slightly. But what I found that even when there were people who were voting for a party which was going against the dominant choice of the Patidar community, socially, I found there was a sense of emulation, For example, you have OBC Thakurs, then you have Alpesh Thakur, etc., who in 2017 played a big role. Then you have communities who are like Darbar, Shankar Singh Waghela, they are also Thakurs, upper caste Thakurs. So Gujarat had different caste but has a mercantile ethos. But in every conversation, you will find that Patidars are veering more towards the NRI phenomenon, and that aspiration you found also among the communities who may have different political choice. Similarly, they set the trend. So that way, the dominant community in Haryana, dominant community, I'm talking about politically in Maharashtra, dominant community in UP, they are not the morally or normatively dominant also. They do not set the trend. You'll find many in Haryana, the Jat community, in terms of their social, cultural, other preferences, they would not like to emulate it. They would differ also. But in Gujarat, what I found that Patidars are not only the politically dominant also, they're also setting the trend in terms of economic aspiration, in terms of that Patidars have a grip in the government and among the officials. They are all the this famous temple Akshardham, they have the grip. So that becomes a kind of a trend. Maybe, but that's a completely crude remark, but not like the Bhadralok in Bengal. But what I found that Bhadralok are not the dominant, community the way we treat Marathas, Jats, Yadavs, Patidars. So that way, even you find in Andhra, Reddy, Kama, Kapus, all sort of Vilamas, all sort of things are there. But Patidars are becoming a sort of an anchor, not only politically, but also in other realm, and that is why I did not found the kind of antagonism, that you found in other states against the dominant community. This is one. Now, if you can repeat the second question, the Dalit voting pattern, how it's different?
Yeah, North and South.
Now that's because if you look from the south, from Maharashtra to Bengal, it's all north. This is one of the complaint of one of a friend from Maharashtra, from Pune. She said that I was in Tamil Nadu and always the remark, you North Indian, and she will take exception. How come in Western state I am a North Indian? Yeah. I said, now they're looking north, up. So everything, the entire from west to east becomes north. Yeah. But one of the differences, see, religiosity in South India, be it Malas or Madigas in Andhra and Telangana, or left and right in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, majority of the Dalits, significantly, overwhelmingly, are Christians. They are, There are other practicality, compulsions, legality, wherein it may not be declared, but that's a reality which every party knows. In society, it is known. So that is why one of the things that BJP cannot have the subaltern resonance. BJP lost Bengal, but mind it, if I go by the CSDS data, and I also found that around 16% to 20% more Dalits voted to BJP, kind of that sort of things perhaps is not going to be the case in South. This is one difference. Secondly, also you find that Congress lost, OBC, or particularly the dominant OBCs were never core voters of the Congress in the North, in Hindi belt, etc. They were also veering to either the regional party or what we call Lohiyite, or the different versions of Lohiyite socialist stream, that some of them came to BJP, some of them went to the, it lost Dalit votes, to various parties, various regional parties, socialist parties, Dalit parties, etc. In the South, you find there is almost a continuation, or a soft corner of the Dalits still for the Congress. The memory of particularly Indira Gandhi still is there. This is one of the things. And from starting from Maharashtra up to Bengal, I think that but for the politically assertive Dalits, so Mahars versus Matangs, so Matangs would be more veering to a party like BJP, more open to negotiate, more negative, trade-offs, representation versus ideological impress, etc. Vis-a-vis. Similarly, you have, we know about the UP, and in the Bihar also you find through various local party, regional party, be it Chirag Paswan led LGP, etc., or Jitana Majid, etc. We do find that Dalits are more kind of flirting with multiple experiment, and therein BJP is also one of the prime beneficiary. It has been, and that is also true in Bengal as far as the Dalit constituency is concerned. So that way I find that if I call subaltern Hindutva project, which is one of my theses, which is driving BJP always have been getting since 1990s the upper caste vote. What catapulted BJP to the corridors of power is the massive subaltern, shift to the BJP, and whether the shift is just a tactical shift or ideological can be debated, but the project is there. In the southern states, I think subaltern Hindutva project, it's going to be primarily led by the OBCs and other intermediary communities. I think, was there a third question or something?
Let's come back to third later on. Let me get Saundarya and Satya. Saundarya, I want to ask you a question, which is, and you may use examples from comparative politics for this, which is, one is, so all the sort of writings on patronage, welfare, basically had this brokers in the between, right? You could call those brokers by different names, but brokers were the intermediaries who were basically linking the party and citizens. Now with these WhatsApp groups coming in and social media playing a big role, we'll have those WhatsApp administrators perhaps. So one, is there now a fusion of the WhatsApp administrator and the earlier broker? And the reason why I'm asking is this, because we know from the, I don't remember the author, but from Gujarat, what the Gujarat work was that actually the patronage machine and riot machine, which was by riot machine conceptualization by Paul Rast, actually overlaps. So in peacetime, they do patronage. In conflict time, they are engaged in riot, right? That's what one of the findings. I'm not sure whether it exists in other places. So are we going to see a fusion of like the social media kind of influencer, administrator, and party broker at the local level? What would that do to the political party itself? Will there be a political party in the central office, or are we going to see a decline of political parties on the ground? Something, like there was a lot of writing in Western Europe in the late 90s, parties in decline. So are we in an era where like parties anyways not organized in India in the Western sort of like cadre party sense? Are we going to see much more depletion of party on the ground?
I mean, this is a fascinating question. So in terms of how or what brokers provide on the ground, right? And this kind of connects to what Supriya was saying in a sense. So think about what we said maybe 15, 20 years ago about how people make decisions, right? This is sort of a low information environment, right? That, people simply don't know how to evaluate. So in a low information environment, they're looking for someone who's credible, who is sort of, making signals or cueing that he or she can get things done, right? And so this is kind of what, for instance, drove these paradoxical results, right? That, in 2014, a lot of people are saying, in surveys that they really care about corruption. And then, people show that, look, the number of people with criminal records elected to parliament is growing, right? So there is this sort of credibility sort of question that becomes very local and is mediated by these people such as, brokers, right? And what, so this is kind of, I think, where media comes in. So what brokers provide, in a sense, is sort of information, right? That, how do people see the state? How do people engage with the state, right? Are they able to go to their, local MLAs and local MPs directly, or do they sort of use these intermediaries? And so that's kind of why brokers had so much power. These were not sort of necessarily people aligned with political parties, but these were people who could get things done, who had sort of credibility on the ground, right? And that's kind of what social media or media, in a sense, is changing with this sort of, influx of money and these carefully curated images, right? Where, suddenly people feel like, there is much more to be accomplished through, like, media channels versus, knowing more or getting information to make these decisions about who's credible has become much more easier, and you don't have to sort of depend on the broker, right? So, when I was doing fieldwork in Delhi, this is not just a sort of function of social media influx. This is also sort of, NGOs coming in and taking over almost the patronage networks in many ways. So this was sort of what I observed in Delhi, where a lot of the service provision conversations now, particularly how people engage, how citizens in urban slums, for instance, interface with, their, local bureaucratic officials or, get things done, is often through NGOs, which means that they don't have the same kind of patron-client relationships anymore, or they're not sort of beholden to that, right? And so the influx of NGOs into sort of planning and PPPs and all of that has kind of already changed the calculus of how or what people are doing, how they're accessing information, first of all, how they're able to hold like these local, corporators accountable, or, MPs accountable, and all of that. And I think social media only kind of drives that trend forward in many ways, where there is much more information. The only problem is we don't know how much of this is fake information, right? So as things balance out, so like, Supriya said, eventually other parties are going to catch up to sort of what the BJP is able to do right now, which is outspend everybody and create this curated image about itself and the supreme leader, right? As political parties start catching up to that, it might very well sort of turn into what Supriya is saying, which is sort of, it supports these local conversations that happen anyway. Now brokers start engaging and brokers start making deals on WhatsApp instead of sort of, hanging around at tea stalls, right? So that's kind of, I think, something that we'll have to wait and watch, but there is much more sort of democratized flow of information that allows people to kind of make these decisions much more easily, I think.
Thank you, Saundarya. Supriya, last word to you, and I'll just use the question that I asked Saundarya, but also going back to your 2014 writing and connecting it to more recent things. I think in our conversation, the candidate is missing. Right. And the reason I said about 2014, because while you were traveling from Guwahati, you stopped in Gonda and interviewed Braj Bhushan Saran Singh, right, who was BJP's candidate and became MP, like was MP before, and and recently he has been in lots of controversy related to allegations by wrestlers. Now, do these things matter to voters on the ground? Something which is like not directly affecting them. And where do candidates are in the picture when like voters are actually just looking at the leader or there is a like, so what I'm trying to understand is basically what is the role of the candidate in this building up of narrative? Where do they stand? And what will happen to candidates if elections become much more leader-centric and parties basically become centralized machine trying to control narratives on the ground? Like, is candidates just a face, or voters in their retrospective and prospective voting models, rational versus emotive models, keep candidates also into the center?
So, I think it's probably changing on the ground, but like for the longest time, it seemed that there are all of these factors in play right now. What's the changing proportion? Like what matters more? I think it really depends election to election. But like I do hear, like when you talk to political parties, like leaders, campaign managers, I think that's where the insight lies, where they themselves seem to be optimizing the candidate. So it's like the candidate is not irrelevant. I mean, although in several elections, people said that like several people who were not deserving won purely because of Modi, like BJP candidates, right? Like a lot of like in some ways, people with no real ground presence of their own won, right? But like I don't think that's entirely true. I think political parties invest a lot of energy in mapping out a constituency, seeing what's the best. Sort of there's all these competing candidates, and they pick and choose. And I don't think they're picking and choosing purely out of civility. Like it's a model where now the leader is all supreme and the organization will dictate everything. Uh, I don't think elections really are like as simple as that. There may be now a greater pull of the leader, but political parties recognize that voting happens along many axes. Identity matters quite a lot, so you want to get the candidate from a community that you want to project a certain appeal to the voter, like what we saw the way BJP selected candidates in UP, right? Like they made a concerted bid to say we are wooing the non-Yadav OBC, we are wooing the non-Jatat Dalit. So candidate selection is sort of dictated by that, which indicates that the candidate उम्मीदवार अभी भी conversation में है. I don't think that it's possible to just win on the basis of the top leadership. But just I lost track of one of the questions you'd asked, Rahul, which is about women, and I thought it's worth sort of coming back to this because women are now sort of, as you say, voter turnouts show that women are a much bigger presence in the voting population and are actively voting. And there again, I feel like it's complex. Like even within a state like UP, this is the last UP election that happened. My colleague was traveling across the state, and we had these discussions where I'm like, make sure you do talk to women voters. And he was easily able to talk to women voters in Bundelkhand, a region that we consider is sort of like backward. And he could not speak to, like, barely could speak to a single woman voter in Western UP, which is, so it's not, it's as we know, it's not sort of, the regional factor matters a lot in how women participate in public life. And we know that in places like Western UP, which are highly patriarchal, they're not able to sort of step out and talk. But there's a state like Bihar where over many years I've seen a major change, and that's because Nitish Kumar very sort of actively wooed women voters, and a lot of government welfare was directed towards sort of girls and women. And I have over many years seen that it's becoming that women are speaking up much more, and they're actually, because they're running the house. The migration out of Bihar means that women are literally sort of the head of the house. And now you can see what impact that kind of independence has on their behavior as voters. So they seem to be also like, there's, you go to, you sort of try to seek out conversations with women, and they're sitting in a group, and you immediately see a generational shift also, where younger women, because of education, mobility, access to smartphones, there's a lot of sometimes humor about how young women are secretly going and voting against what their husbands have asked them.
Yeah.
That's happening too.
Thank you. Thank you, Supriya, Sajjan, and Saundarya. For anyone who listened today and whoever gets a chance to listen to this on YouTube, this was a real masterclass on political ethnography. And anyone, to young students and young journalists, I hope you'll find this conversation useful. Thank you for everyone who joined us today, participated in conversation. Next month, in fact, like I have a lineup, we'll get the date soon. We'll actually talk about political consultancy and how they are shaping elections, and we're going to talk about leadership as well, and how do PM candidates and those kind of things matter in election. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Supriya, Sajjan, and Saundarya, for sharing your insights so patiently with us. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. See you.
you.
Bye-bye.